When it comes to tough conversations, most people freeze, avoid, or explode, and none of those options actually solve anything. The truth is, a difficult conversation isn't dangerous, it's just uncomfortable. But we've tied so much fear to honesty, so much anxiety to speaking up, that we forget communication is not supposed to feel like walking through a minefield. It's supposed to be two people trying to understand each other better. Still, when emotions rise, defenses go up, and clarity disappears. That's where intentional communication becomes your anchor. You don't walk into a tough conversation to prove a point. You walk in to build one. And when you lead with intent instead of impulse, everything changes. The tone lowers, the walls soften, and suddenly, both sides get room to breathe instead of room to attack. Most people think that saying something hard requires being harsh. It doesn't. Direct and kind can live in the same sentence. You can tell someone the truth without cutting them. You can express frustration without bringing destruction. The moment you understand that, you stop fearing honesty and start using it as a tool. Tough conversations break relationships only when we deliver truth like a weapon instead of like a bridge. The goal is connection, not domination. The challenge is keeping your voice calm even when your heart isn't. That's why saying the hard things softly is such a powerful skill. It disarms defensiveness before it even starts. But tough conversations don't fall apart because of what you say. They fall apart because of what you don't hear. Most people listen to reload, meaning they're busy preparing their next counterpoint instead of actually processing what's being said. You can't solve what you don't understand. When you listen with the goal of clarity instead of victory, arguments shrink, egos settle, and solutions finally have space to exist. Real listening makes people feel seen, and when people feel seen, they stop fighting to be heard. That's how you shift the entire temperature of the room without raising your voice even once. Another powerful part of mastering difficult conversations is protecting the pause. That 2-second breath between what you feel and what you say is the difference between progress and regret. In the heat of emotion, your brain fires fast, and your mouth wants to follow. But that tiny pause, a breath, a swallow, a moment where you remind yourself you're in control, can save you from hours of conflict. You don't need to react immediately to be effective. In fact, the slower you respond, the more weight your words carry. Space is clarity, and clarity is everything in tough conversations. The biggest mistake people make is mixing the person with the problem. When you attack someone's character, you lose them. When you address their behavior, you keep the conversation constructive. Saying you're disrespectful ignites defensiveness. Saying when you talk over me, I feel dismissed creates space for awareness. You're not fighting each other. You're working together to fight the issue. That shift in framing can turn a conflict into a collaboration. And the moment both people stop defending themselves and start understanding each other, the entire conversation transforms. Mastering tough conversations isn't about being perfect. It's about being intentional. It's about staying steady when the other person gets emotional, speaking clearly when your voice wants to shake, and remembering that honesty delivered with calmness builds better relationships than silence delivered with resentment. The conversations you avoid are the ones that drain you. The conversations you face are the ones that free you. And when you learn to communicate with clarity, compassion, and courage, you stop running from tough conversations and start leading them. When you walk into a tough conversation without a clear intent, you walk in blind. The conversation becomes less about fighting and more about understanding. Even if the other person enters with defensiveness or agitation, your steadiness gives them fewer reasons to escalate. Intent is contagious in the best way. It sets the emotional climate of the conversation before either of you says a single sentence. Leading with intent is not about controlling the other person. It's about controlling your direction. It's the difference between reacting to every emotional spark and choosing which fires are actually worth putting out. It's the difference between walking into a conversation blind and walking in with vision. It's the difference between words that create damage and words that create direction. When you know why you're talking before you start talking, you don't just communicate better, you lead the entire interaction with confidence, clarity, and purpose. Saying the hard things softly is one of the most underrated communication skills you can develop, because most people think being honest automatically means being harsh. They think truth has to come with an edge, or that being direct means delivering their message like a punch. But real strength in communication isn't measured by how hard your words hit. It's measured by how clearly your message lands without breaking the relationship in the process. Saying the hard things softly is not weakness, it's precision. It's controlling your delivery so the truth gets heard instead of triggering defensiveness, shutting the conversation down, or escalating conflict into something you never intended. When you deliver difficult truths harshly, the other person stops listening to the message and starts reacting to the tone. They don't hear your point, they feel your force. And once someone feels attacked, the conversation is no longer about the issue. It becomes about protecting themselves. Walls go up, emotions flare, and suddenly you're arguing about how you said something instead of what you meant. Speaking softly doesn't dilute the truth. It simply makes it digestible. It gets under the armor instead of hitting the armor. It creates space for the other person to actually absorb what you're saying instead of bracing for impact. Speaking softly doesn't mean sugarcoating. It means delivering your message with intention instead of impulse. It means removing sarcasm, removing the sting, and stripping your tone of anything that feels like a personal attack. It means focusing on clarity, not volume. When you speak this way, every word becomes stronger because it's not fighting through unnecessary noise. Hard truths delivered calmly carry more weight because the listener can't blame your tone, your attitude, or your intensity. All that remains is the truth itself. There is something profoundly disarming about calm honesty. When you look someone in the eye and say, "This hurt me," or "This isn't working," or "I need something different from you," in a steady, grounded voice, they can't hide behind defensiveness as easily. You're not giving them an emotional reaction to react to. You're not making the conversation about your frustration. You're simply naming what needs to be named. And the simplicity of that, without accusation, without heat, forces the other person to face the message instead of the delivery. It is one of the most effective ways to bypass emotional resistance. When you say the hard things softly, you're also modeling emotional maturity. You're showing the other person how a difficult conversation can feel. You're demonstrating that honesty doesn't have to be loud or aggressive. You're proving that you can confront without attacking, correct without shaming, and express hurt without trying to hurt back. This type of communication sets a tone that invites cooperation instead of conflict. It shows that you're not here to win. You're here to be understood, and that shifts the entire dynamic. People often fear speaking softly because they think it makes them vulnerable or less authoritative. But authority isn't in your volume, it's in your control. When you can speak calmly while addressing something difficult, you show mastery over yourself. You show that you don't need to overpower the moment to own it. You don't need to raise your voice to raise the level of the conversation. Calmness is your leverage. It signals that you're confident in what you're saying and you're not afraid of the truth you're delivering. That composure alone gives your message strength. Another powerful advantage of saying the hard things softly is that it keeps the conversation focused on solutions. When people feel safe, they are more willing to correct, compromise, or take accountability. They don't feel attacked, so they don't have to defend. They can actually explore the issue with you instead of fighting you. A soft tone opens the door for collaboration by lowering emotional tension. It turns a confrontation into an opportunity to improve the relationship rather than damage it. This approach also protects you. When you speak harshly, you often regret your delivery later. Maybe not the message, but the way it came out. Saying the hard things softly prevents those regrets. It lets you walk away knowing you honored both yourself and the conversation. You said what needed to be said without losing control, without reacting emotionally, and without contributing to unnecessary conflict. It keeps your integrity clean and your conscience clear. At its core, saying the hard things softly is about intention. It's about choosing to communicate in a way that respects both the truth and the relationship. It's about remembering that the goal of a tough conversation isn't to dominate. It's to be understood. It's about realizing that softness is not the opposite of strength. It's the expression of it. When you deliver hard truths with softness, your words hit deeper, your message stays cleaner, and the conversation has a chance to become transformational instead of destructive. Most conversations fall apart long before anyone raises their voice, storms out, or shuts down. They fail in the first few seconds, when one person stops listening and starts mentally preparing their comeback. That's the moment the conversation shifts from connection to competition. Instead of trying to understand the other person, people begin loading their next argument, their next defense, their next justification. And once that happens, the conversation is no longer about resolving anything. It becomes two people talking at each other, not with each other. Listening to understand instead of listening to reload is one of the hardest communication habits to build. but it is also one of the most transformative. Because when someone feels genuinely heard, the whole tone of the conversation softens. And when you're actually listening, the entire direction of the conversation changes. Listening to understand requires a different posture. It requires putting your ego in the back seat long enough to let the other person finish their thought without interruption. You're not mentally assembling evidence. You're not waiting for a pause so you can jump in. You're not crafting the perfect comeback. You're simply absorbing what they're trying to communicate. Not just their words, but their meaning. Not just their tone, but the emotional context beneath it. When you do this, you start hearing things that were invisible before. Fear disguised as anger, frustration disguised as sarcasm, hurt disguised as distance. You can only see what's really happening when you stop preparing your next line and actually pay attention. Most people don't realize how obvious it is when they're not listening. Their eyes dart. Their body language closes up. Their responses come too quickly as if rehearsed. They start talking before the other person is finished. All of these things tell the other person, I'm not here for your perspective, I'm here to protect mine. The moment someone senses that, trust dissolves. They stop opening up. They stop being honest. The conversation turns into a battle for who can defend themselves better. Understanding becomes impossible, because neither person feels safe enough to be understood. On the other hand, listening to understand creates safety. When you slow down, make eye contact, and actually take in what the other person is saying, they feel valued, they feel respected, they feel seen. And when someone feels seen, they stop fighting. They stop racing. They stop assuming you're the enemy. Instead, they lean into the conversation because they can feel you're not just waiting to fire back. You're genuinely trying to comprehend their point of view. That alone can de-escalate tension faster than anything you could say. Listening this way doesn't mean you agree with. It doesn't mean you're surrendering your beliefs or accepting blame that isn't yours. Understanding is not agreement. It's acknowledgement. It's saying, I hear where you're coming from, not you're right. People confuse those two, which is why they get defensive. They think listening means weakness, but it actually requires the highest level of self-control. Anyone can interrupt. Anyone can get loud. Anyone can defend themselves. Very few people can stay calm enough to listen without preloading their next response. When you listen without reloading, something powerful happens. You respond instead of react. Reactions are fast, impulsive, and emotional. Responses are intentional, thoughtful, and grounded. Reactions escalate. Responses clarify. You can only respond well when you have taken the time to actually understand what was said. When you don't understand, your responses become assumptions, projections, and misinterpretations. And that's where most arguments spiral. Half the time, people aren't even fighting about the same thing. They're fighting about what they think the other person meant. Listening to understand also forces you to stay present. You can't drift into old grievances or future worry. You have to stay in the moment, hearing what is being said right now. That presence alone can reveal solutions that were invisible before. You start asking better questions. You start seeing what the real issue is instead of dancing around surface-level frustrations. You start noticing patterns, fears, unmet needs, things that get buried under the noise when you're focused on making your point instead of hearing theirs. This way of listening also gives you more influence. People naturally follow those who make them feel understood. They trust you more. They open up more. They're more willing to meet you in the middle because they don't feel threatened. When you show someone that their perspective matters, even if you disagree, they become far more receptive to hearing yours. Influence doesn't come from speaking first or speaking loud. It comes from showing that you're tuned in, not tuned out. Listening to understand is not passive. It's strategic. It's what mature communicators do. It's what grounded people do. It's how strong personalities are de-escalated and how fragile conversations stay intact. When you listen without loading up your next sentence, you stop fighting the person and start addressing the problem. And that's how conversations stop collapsing and start healing. A pause may be the smallest action in a conversation, but it is often the most powerful. Most people don't realize how fast they react when emotions rise. Someone says something offensive, dismissive, sarcastic, or challenging, and before their brain even fully processes the words, their mouth has already fired back. That split-second impulse is where most arguments explode, most relationships crack, and most conversations derail. A 2-second pause sounds simple, but in emotionally charged moments, it feels like holding back a tidal wave. Yet that tiny pause is exactly what protects you from saying the sentence you'll replay later, from sending the message you'll regret, from escalating something that never needed to become a fight. Pausing before reacting is not about silence, it's about control. It's about interrupting the automatic loop that your nervous system jumps into when you feel attacked, judged, or misunderstood.